be a guest zookeeper while Alf is on PTO. So today we have with us Jon Hall, who's lead product manager at BMC, and we're going to talk about IT asset management trends and sort of look out a few years to look at IT asset management in 2015. So welcome, Jon, to Alf's Zoo today. How are you?
Hi.
Great.
Hi, Kathryn. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So I guess, Jon, let's kick off the session today with really, where does asset management tend to sit within an organization?
This is one of those interesting questions that probably reflects the history of asset management a little bit. One of the best indicators, I think, it was Martin Thompson's IT asset management review site, which I think last year did a survey on where asset management sat within the business. And the only real conclusion, I think it's fair to say, is that there isn't really a single conclusion. But interestingly, in 55, I think, % of cases, certainly over half of cases, IT asset management actually sat outside the ITSM discipline. So it's more typically located within a finance department or within an operational IT department, but not within that area that we would normally wrap up under ITSM.
And how has this come about?
I think that there's probably regional variations. Interestingly, ITAM as a discipline is probably older than the kind of current generation of IT service management. So we find examples of marketplaces in Europe. France is quite a typical one, where historically there was a requirement for companies to account for their IT assets, whether that was for tax or regulatory purposes. And so a whole industry of ITAM tools sprung up even as far back as the 1980s. And I think in general, in a sort of on a more general basis, quite often organizations have been led down the path of IT asset management by the finance department, often before they began to see it as part of an important part of managing their IT business.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say is changing now?
I'm sorry, beg your pardon?
What would you say is changing now?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a really big change, I think, happening now, which is that, particularly as companies move towards a desire to better understand how much their IT department is costing and what is the return on investment from that department. And in other words, as they're driven to treat IT more as a business and not just as a cost center, suddenly they're finding, well, hang on, we spend 60% of our budget with suppliers, and a lot of that budget is IT assets as well as people. And as a result, suddenly there's a really big focus on exactly what they're spending and where. And another thing, of course, that really is driving ITAM as a discipline right now is the challenges of software licensing. Mm-hmm. So we've seen a couple of mega trends in licensing driven by mega trends in IT. The biggest one, of course, being virtualization. We hit a point a few years ago where suddenly software vendors found that their stuff was being run in a completely different framework. And just a pure count of devices or even CPUs was kind of meaningless when you could be running 100 instances on one device. So we found that one particular pressure area has come from the software side, the need to actually account for what's running and where, well, as vendors get more aggressive with their audits.
What about the cloud and asset management?
I'm sorry, Kathryn, I lost the audio.
What about the cloud and asset management?
Well, this is, yeah, and this is really what's probably the biggest driver of change in ITAM. So suddenly you have a situation where, perhaps 10 years ago, an IT asset manager would be focused on bits of tin. We could pretty much assume if there were, 1,000 servers in the company, we had 1,000 instances, 1,000 things software could be running on. Suddenly, asset is much more multi-layered than that, because you still have a physical infrastructure, and that stuff still needs to be maintained. It still has suppliers. It still has contracts. It still has to be patched and repaired and ultimately replaced. But then above that, we have a whole nother layer of operating system instances of computers as the applications see them, and that is of course relevant to licensing, because I may be running my database on 1,000 virtual machines, each of which needs licensing. So especially in large organizations, that whole virtualization challenge has really made asset management a much more multi-layered and kind of interestingly complex discipline.
Yep, good. What about sort of where will we be in 2015? What will be different, and what do IT asset management professionals need to do to ensure that they keep up with the changes?
I think this is where the fun starts almost for IT asset management. I talk to a lot of people in the industry, and it's always interesting. I think there's a lot of people working in IT asset management right now who feel a little underappreciated, because they're in a really sort of, they have an interesting viewpoint of where money is being spent well, where it's being spent badly. You know, where the company is missing opportunities to better utilize its asset base. And I think you can almost, I can illustrate this best probably by talking about a presentation that I made at the ITAM, the International Association of IT Asset Managers Conference last year, where with a room of about 60 people, I asked, how many of you are actively involved day to day in asset management? And perhaps unsurprisingly, 58 or so of the people in the room said yes. So with 58 hands up, I then asked them, how many of you feel you could probably deliver really significant value over and above what you're doing today if you were properly invested in? And I reckon of those 58 hands, about 54 still stayed up. So people are kind of feeling a little underappreciated, but I think, in answer to the question, where does asset management need to move in the next few years, it really comes down to the fact that the asset manager is in a really useful position as well. They can be very cross-functional. They have touch points between the financial side of IT and the operational. Mm-hmm. And I really think asset management needs to be moving itself into a much more pivotal role, and almost to become a very, very trusted advisor to the CFO, the CIO, all the people making buying decisions about that, things in IT.
That's good. Any sort of concluding thoughts? Anything else you'd like to share, touch upon?
Yeah, I mean, I heard a very interesting story which kind of illustrates the power of good asset management, and that came late last year from a large medical research charity here in the UK. Very, very high-profile organization, a bit of a household name in the kind of fundraising market, and also very, very important in the sphere they work in. And of course, for these organizations, for medical organizations, the amount of data they're dealing with is enormous. I think they told me a single human genome can be kind of 100 megabyte download. So they're generating huge amounts of data, and of course they have the IT assets to manage that. They're really big consumers of high volume storage, and that means the frontline production equipment will typically be expensive specialist storage networks right at the cutting edge of technology. So they buy these, and then 3 years down the line, that technology is becoming obsolete. It needs to be replaced. It's right at the front lines. So in this example, that with effective asset management, the organization was able to, as that hardware was being replaced, they also noticed at the same time that there was a need for storage for the less sort of frontline operational data, but just storage to back up the company's desktop PCs and laptops, because again, that was coming up for replacement. So rather than make an entire purchase of desktop and laptop backup storage, they were able to repurpose their outgoing storage network technology. The asset management function was also able to identify, because they built up an effective network of information and suppliers, they were able to identify a much, much cheaper third-party supplier who could then take on the support of that repurposed hardware. So again, they were able to save a huge amount of money on both purchasing new hardware and supporting brand new frontline hardware. And I mean, it's a single example, but I think it's important that in asset management we realize that asset management professionals are in that interesting area where they can be they need to be getting very, very cross-functional, just sort of keeping abreast of technology trends and changes, because their organization will constantly be making purchasing decisions, constantly be bringing in new technologies and hardware. And we need to deal with, as ITAM professionals, we need to be dealing with the risks and the opportunities that presents. So we, on the risk side, it can be as straightforward as making sure the company doesn't do anything a little daft that will suddenly increase its software license exposure to a particular product because we haven't taken account of the accounting rules. But on the opportunity side, it really is, the asset manager is in that pretty unique position of seeing all the things going on around them, seeing where the company can collaborate better, can repurpose devices better, can save money, and all that stuff really needs to be, as they're doing it, they need to be telling the story of what they're achieving.
That's great. And in that example you shared, was the asset management team able to make the organization aware of their value?
Yeah, very much so in this case.
That's great.
But again, that it is important. It is important because ITAM tends to, I think, have an unfairly low profile in organizations. It's not always the hottest topic. It's not, the tools that we use in ITAM are not always the stuff that gets all the market attention and the analysts' attention and the media's attention. But as a discipline, we are in a position in ITAM to save companies a huge amount of money. I see companies who are spending $800 million, $1 billion on software each year in the largest cases. So you've only got to find a few percent, and you're starting to be in the tens of millions.
Yeah.
And that's certainly the millions, but potentially the tens of millions. So there's, if we can grasp those opportunities, absolutely, the asset management function needs to communicate what they're achieving.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, this has been really interesting. I thank you for your time today. And I thank Al for this opportunity to host Alf while he was on vacation, or as you say, on holiday. Have a wonderful day, John, evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for your time today. We're signing off from Alf.